What if a kitchen slave knew every ingredient that could kill? What if Christmas Eve, 1834, became the night when Virginia's most powerful plantation owners gathered for their final feast? In the grand mansion of Whitmore Plantation, Tobias Hartwell stirred wedding soup with steady hands. While wealthy guests laughed above, he added something special to their meal, something that would change everything forever. How far would you go for justice? Before continuing the story, tell us which country you're watching from. Subscribe for more hidden historical stories. Virginia, December 1834. Snow fell like sugar on the rolling hills. The white flakes covered everything in silence. But underneath the beauty, darker things waited. Whitmore Plantation stretched for miles. The main house stood 3 stories tall. White columns reached toward the gray sky. Red brick walls glowed warm against the cold. Every window flickered with candlelight tonight. This was the biggest wedding Virginia had seen in years. The smell of roasting turkey drifted from the kitchen house. Honey ham glazed with brown sugar, fresh bread baking in brick ovens, sweet potato pudding cooling on wooden tables. The rich smells made your mouth water. But not everyone would taste this food. Behind the main house, 20 slave cabins lined a dirt road. Thin smoke rose from their chimneys. Inside, families huddled together for warmth. They ate corn mush while their masters prepared to feast on the finest foods. The difference was as clear as black and white. Master Edmund Whitmore was marrying Miss Catherine Bellwood tonight. Her father owned 5 plantations. Together they would control thousands of acres and hundreds of human souls. This marriage wasn't just about love, it was about power. The kitchen house buzzed like a beehive. Steam rose from giant pots. Slaves ran between stoves and serving tables. Everyone worked fast and careful. One mistake could mean a whipping, or worse. The head cook, Mama Josephine, shouted orders. Her gray hair was tied back with a worn cloth. Her hands moved quick despite her 60 years. She had cooked for 3 generations of Whitmores. She knew exactly what they wanted. But tonight felt different. Something hung in the air, more than just the smell of food. Whispered conversations stopped when certain people walked by. Glances passed between slaves who seemed to know something. What was it? The wedding guests started arriving at 4 o'clock. Fancy carriages rolled up the long driveway. Men in black suits and tall hats. Ladies in silk dresses of green and gold. They laughed as house slaves helped them from their carriages. They handed over their coats without looking at the faces that served them. Judge Harrison from Richmond stepped down from his carriage. He owned 3 plantations and 200 slaves. Senator Morrison followed behind him. He had sent dozens of runaway slaves to the gallows. These were not kind men gathering for celebration. These were the rulers of Virginia's slave empire. In the parlor, they drank imported wine. They spoke of cotton prices and tobacco crops. They discussed which slaves worked hardest, which ones needed more discipline. They planned business deals that would buy and sell human beings like cattle at market. The bride glowed in white satin and pearls. Her father had given her diamond earrings as a wedding gift. She smiled and accepted compliments on her beauty. Slave children, no older than 10, served her champagne on silver trays. She never looked at their faces either. The snow kept falling outside. It covered the whipping post near the overseer's house. It hid the bloodstains that summer rain could never wash away. Everything looked peaceful and clean, but looks could lie. The church bell from town rang across the plantation. 6 o'clock, time for final preparations. The ceremony would begin in 2 hours. Then the real feast would start, the feast that would change everything. But in the kitchen house, other plans were taking shape. Careful hands measured ingredients that had nothing to do with recipes. Knowledge passed down from African grandmothers guided steady fingers. Plants that grew wild in Virginia woods held secrets that masters never learned. House slaves polished silverware one last time. They folded napkins into perfect triangles. They checked that every glass sparkled without spots. Everything had to be perfect for Virginia's most important families, perfect for their last meal together. The temperature dropped as darkness fell. Icicles formed on the kitchen house roof, but inside, ovens kept everything warm. Pots bubbled with soups and gravies. The final preparations began for a wedding feast that no one would ever forget, a feast that would become legend. Tonight, Christmas Eve, 1834, snow would cover more than just the ground. It would cover secrets that had been buried too long. The wedding was about to begin. Tobias Hartwell moved through the kitchen like smoke, 35 years old with dark skin and steady hands, tall and lean from years of hard work. Scars on his back told stories he never spoke about, but his eyes burned bright with intelligence that no whip could break. He had been born right here on Whitmore Plantation. His mother, Sarah, was head cook before him. She died when Tobias was 15, but not before teaching him everything she knew about cooking, and much more dangerous things. Sarah came from West Africa as a young woman, stolen from her village and sold like cattle. She remembered her grandmother's knowledge of plants and roots, which ones healed pain, which ones brought sleep, and which ones brought something else entirely. "Knowledge is power," Sarah whispered to young Tobias during long kitchen nights. But power means nothing if you don't know when to use it. Tobias learned to read by watching Master Edmund's children study. He hid behind doors and memorized their lessons. He practiced writing in dirt behind the slave quarters. Reading opened new worlds for him. He snuck into the master's library and found books about plants and medicine. He memorized everything he could. When Sarah died from lung sickness, Mama Josephine became head cook. She was 60 now, with gray hair and aching joints. She trusted Tobias completely. He became her right hand. He prepared sauces and seasonings that made guests praise their food. But they never thanked the hands that cooked it. At 22, Tobias met Rebecca at a corn-shucking party. She worked in the main house, cleaning and serving, beautiful with gentle hands and a quick smile. She could read better than most white women. They fell in love fast and deep. Their wedding was simple but real. They jumped the broom while other slaves sang spirituals. Master Edmund let them live together in Cabin 7, the one closest to the kitchen house. For 3 years, they built a life within slavery's limits. Rebecca got pregnant twice. Both babies died before birth. Slave women often lost children because of hard work and poor food. Each loss broke their hearts a little more, but they kept hoping for better days. Then Master Edmund's brother Charles came home drunk one night last winter. Charles Whitmore was 30 years old and mean as a snake, especially when he drank whiskey. He often visited the slave quarters when liquor made him dangerous. That night, he broke down the door of Cabin 7. Tobias was working late in the kitchen house. He heard Rebecca scream from across the yard. He ran through the snow as fast as he could, but Charles had a pistol pointed at the cabin door. "Stay back, boy," Charles laughed. "Your woman needs to learn her place." Tobias heard terrible sounds from inside, Rebecca crying and fighting, Charles cursing and hitting. But the gun kept Tobias away. He stood in the snow feeling helpless and angry, more angry than he had ever felt in his life. The next morning they found Rebecca hanging from the oak tree near the main house. Charles claimed she killed herself from shame. Master Edmund believed his brother's story. The sheriff never came to ask questions. No one cared about a dead slave woman. Tobias buried his wife in the slave cemetery behind the quarters. He carved her name on a wooden cross with his own hands. That night, alone in Cabin 7, something inside him died. But something else was born, a cold fire that would burn until justice came. For 8 months Tobias planned and waited. He studied the master's habits and important guests. He learned about Virginia's most powerful families, when they met and where they gathered. He waited for the right opportunity. The wedding announcement came in October. Master Edmund would marry Catherine Bellwood on Christmas Eve. Her father owned 5 plantations. The ceremony would bring together the most powerful men in Virginia, senators and judges and wealthy merchants, all in one room, all eating the same food. Tobias saw his chance. He began collecting special ingredients months before. Castor beans from the pretty plants around the main house, pokeweed berries from the forest edge, seeds from plants that looked harmless but held deadly secrets. His mother had taught him which ones to pick and when. He dried them carefully in the kitchen house attic. He ground them into powder, finer than flour. He tested tiny amounts on rats from the barn. The results told him his mother's knowledge was true. These innocent-looking plants could kill grown men. But Tobias was not a killer by nature. He struggled with what he planned to do. Late at night, he talked to Rebecca's grave. He asked her spirit for strength and guidance. "They took you from me," he whispered to the wooden cross. "They take everything from us. Children sold away from mothers, husbands separated from wives, bodies broken by work and whips. When does it stop?" The wind through the oak trees sounded like her voice answering back. "When we make it stop." Other slaves sensed something building. Samuel lost his boy when Master Edmund sold the child to pay gambling debts. Maria watched her daughter die from fever because no doctor would treat slave children. They formed a quiet circle of understanding, not exactly planning, just knowing that change might come in unexpected ways. Now Christmas Eve had arrived. The wedding guests were drinking wine in the parlor. The kitchen buzzed with final preparations. Tobias stood at his cooking station with steady hands. Tonight, Virginia's most powerful slave owners would eat their last meal together. His mother's knowledge lived in his fingertips. Rebecca's memory burned in his heart. The time for waiting was over. Christmas Eve morning arrived cold and bitter, but the coldness outside was nothing compared to the ice in Tobias's heart. He had carried this frozen anger for 8 long months, ever since that terrible night when Charles Whitmore destroyed his world. It started like any other winter evening. Rebecca was cleaning the main house after dinner. Tobias worked late in the kitchen, preparing bread dough for the next day. The snow fell soft and quiet outside. Everything seemed peaceful. Everything was a lie. Charles Whitmore rode up to the plantation around 10 o'clock, drunk as usual. His horse could barely carry him steady. He stumbled off and headed straight for the slave quarters. Tobias heard the horse from the kitchen house. Something felt wrong about the way Charles moved through the darkness. Rebecca was walking back to Cabin 7 when Charles saw her. Even drunk, he noticed how pretty she was, how her dress fit her small waist, how she walked with her head held high despite being someone's property. "Where you going, girl?" Charles called out, blocking her path. "Home to my husband, Master Charles," Rebecca said politely. She knew to be respectful, but she also knew to be afraid. Charles laughed and grabbed her arm. "Your husband can wait. I got something to show you first." Rebecca tried to pull away. "Please, Master Charles, let me go home." But Charles was stronger, and he was angry about losing money at cards in town. He wanted to hurt somebody. Rebecca became his target because she was there, because she was beautiful, because he could. He dragged her toward Cabin 7. Rebecca screamed for help. Other slaves heard but stayed in their cabins. They knew better than to challenge a white man, even a drunk one, even when he was wrong. Tobias heard the screams from the kitchen house. He dropped his bread dough and ran through the snow. His heart pounded like thunder in his chest. Those were Rebecca's screams. His wife was in danger. But when he reached Cabin 7, Charles had his pistol out, pointed right at Tobias's chest. The drunk man's eyes were wild with rage and liquor. "Stay back, boy," Charles snarled. "This is between me and your woman." You take one step closer, and I'll put a bullet in your heart." Tobias stopped. He had no choice. A dead man couldn't help his wife. He stood in the snow and listened to terrible sounds from inside his cabin. Rebecca crying and begging, Charles laughing and cursing, the sounds of violence and shame. Other slaves gathered in the darkness. Samuel from cabin 3, Maria with her children, old Benjamin, who had seen too much suffering in his 70 years. They all watched helplessly. They all knew what was happening. None of them could stop it. The nightmare lasted an hour. Finally, Charles stumbled out of the cabin, buttoning his pants. He looked at the gathered slaves with cold eyes. "Anyone who talks about this gets sold south," he warned. "Cotton plantations in Mississippi need workers. You understand me?" Everyone nodded. They understood. Speaking up meant being separated from families forever, sold to places where slaves died from heat and overwork. Charles climbed back on his horse and rode away into the night. Tobias found Rebecca curled up on their bed, bruised and bleeding, her dress torn to pieces, her spirit broken like glass. She wouldn't look at him, couldn't speak, just cried soft and heartbroken in the darkness. For 3 days Rebecca said nothing. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't leave the cabin. Tobias brought her water and bread. He held her hand and whispered that everything would be okay. But they both knew it was a lie. On the 4th day, Tobias came back from kitchen work to find the cabin empty. He searched everywhere, called her name until his voice went hoarse. Other slaves helped him look. They checked the fields and woods, the barn and root cellar. They found her hanging from the oak tree near the main house, a rope around her neck, her feet swaying in the winter wind. The tree that masters used for whipping slaves had claimed another victim. Charles told everyone she killed herself from shame. Master Edmund believed his brother without question. The sheriff never came to investigate. Why would he? Dead slave women didn't matter to Virginia law. They never had. Tobias cut Rebecca down with shaking hands. He carried her body to the slave cemetery behind the quarters. He dug her grave in frozen ground while tears turned to ice on his face. He carved her name on a wooden cross. Rebecca Hartwell, beloved wife, 1812 to 1834. That night, alone in cabin 7, Tobias felt something break inside him. Not his heart. That was already broken. Something deeper. His faith in justice, his hope for mercy, his belief that good would eventually win over evil. He realized that Virginia courts would never punish Charles Whitmore. White men didn't get executed for killing slave women. They got congratulated. Sheriffs didn't investigate crimes against property. Judges didn't care about black tears or broken families. If justice wouldn't come from Virginia law, it would have to come from somewhere else. For 8 months, Tobias planned and waited. He watched Master Edmund's habits. He studied the important guests who visited the plantation. He learned about Virginia's powerful families and when they gathered together. The wedding announcement came like a gift from God. Master Edmund would marry Catherine Bellwood on Christmas Eve. Her father owned 5 plantations in 3 counties. The ceremony would bring together senators and judges, wealthy merchants and plantation owners, all the men who kept slavery alive in Virginia, all in one room, all eating the same food. Tobias remembered his mother's lessons about plants and poisons. He remembered Rebecca's gentle hands and broken spirit. He thought about all the slave women who had suffered like she did, all the families torn apart by sale, all the children who would never know their parents. The wedding feast would be Virginia's most powerful slave owners eating together for the last time. They just didn't know it yet. But Tobias knew. He had known for months. Tonight, justice would finally come to dinner. The time for mercy was over. The season of reckoning had begun. Tobias's grandmother never told him her real name, the one from before the slave ships came. She said that name died when they chained her in the dark belly of a ship. but she remembered everything else from her village in West Africa. Her name was Casey when she was young and free. She lived near a great river where the water ran clear and fish jumped silver in the sunlight. Her own grandmother was a healer who knew every plant in the forest, which roots stopped bleeding, which leaves brought down fever, which berries helped women in childbirth. Cassie learned by following her grandmother into the deep woods. They would walk for hours, collecting bark and seeds and flowers. The old woman would make Cassie taste tiny amounts, smell different plants, feel their textures between her fingers. Plants are teachers, her grandmother said in their own language, but you must listen carefully to their lessons. Some teach healing, others teach different things. When Casey turned 16, slave raiders came to her village. They burned the huts and took the young people in chains. Cassie watched her grandmother die, trying to protect the children. The last thing the old woman whispered was, "Remember the plants. Remember everything." The ship journey to America took 2 months. Many people died in the darkness below deck. Cassie survived by remembering her grandmother's teachings. She shared what little healing knowledge she could with the other prisoners. She helped deliver babies in chains. She eased the pain of the dying. When the ship reached Charleston, Cassie was sold to a Virginia plantation owner. She was strong and young, good for field work and breeding more slaves. But she carried something the masters could never buy or sell, knowledge that lived in her mind and heart. On the plantation, Cassie became Sarah. She worked tobacco fields from sunrise to sunset. Her hands bled and her back ached. But in her spare moments, she explored Virginia's forests. She found plants that reminded her of home, others that were new but carried familiar power. Pokeweed with purple berries that looked like grapes, but eating them brought sickness and death. Castor bean plants with pretty leaves and seeds. The masters grew them as decorations around their houses. They had no idea what those innocent-looking seeds could do. Sarah married a field hand named Joseph when she was 20. He was gentle and strong, with hands that could carve beautiful things from wood. They had children together, 2 boys and a girl, all born into slavery but raised with love. Sarah taught her children everything she remembered from Africa: how to identify healing plants, how to prepare medicines for common sickness. But she also taught them the other knowledge, the dangerous knowledge that could bring justice when laws failed. Never forget, she told them during long summer evenings, we are not just bodies that work in fields. We carry wisdom from across the ocean, wisdom that our masters cannot understand or control. Sarah's first 2 children died from fever when they were small. Only Tobias survived to adulthood. She poured all her knowledge into him, every plant lesson, every story from Africa, every secret that could mean survival or resistance. When Tobias was 10, Sarah became head cook for the Whitmore family. She moved from field work to kitchen work. This gave her access to the main house, to the master's library, to books that most slaves never saw. Late at night, Sarah would sneak into the library with a candle. She taught herself to read using the master's books, medical books about plants and herbs, recipe books that talked about spices and seasonings. She memorized everything she could. Then she taught Tobias. "Reading is freedom for the mind," she whispered as they studied by candlelight. "They can chain our bodies, but they cannot chain our thoughts if we keep learning." Tobias learned fast. He had his mother's sharp mind and his grandmother's memory for details. By age 15, he could read better than most white children. He knew more about plants and medicine than most doctors, and he understood secrets that could save lives or end them. Sarah died from lung sickness when Tobias was 20. Her last words were instructions about special plants growing near the slave cemetery. "For healing," she said with her final breath, "or for justice. You will know when the time comes." Tobias buried his mother next to the unmarked graves of his brother and sister. He carved her name on a wooden cross. Sarah Hartwell, teacher, healer, keeper of ancient wisdom. For years, Tobias used his mother's knowledge only for good. He helped sick slaves get better. He eased the pain of women in childbirth. He prepared healing teas for children with fever. The other slaves came to trust him like they had trusted his mother. But he also remembered the other lessons, the dangerous ones, which plants could kill if prepared correctly, how much was needed, how long the effects would take. This knowledge sat quiet in his mind like seeds waiting for the right season. The right season came when Charles Whitmore destroyed Rebecca, when Virginia justice showed its true face, when Tobias realized that healing wasn't enough anymore. Sometimes justice required different medicine, stronger medicine that his grandmother had learned in African forests, that his mother had taught him in whispered lessons. Tonight, Christmas Eve, 1834, 3 generations of African plant wisdom would serve Virginia's slave owners their final meal. The ancient knowledge would finally bear its bitter fruit. The seeds of justice had been planted long ago. Now it was time for harvest. Christmas Eve night arrived with bitter wind and fresh snow. The wedding preparations reached their final hour. Tobias stood at his cooking station in the kitchen house. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. Tonight, justice would finally be served. The guests had been arriving since 4 o'clock. Fancy carriages rolled up the long driveway. Men in black suits and silk top hats. Women in emerald and gold dresses that cost more than a slave's life. They laughed and called out greetings while house slaves took their coats and boots. Judge Harrison stepped down from his carriage first. He owned 4 plantations and 300 slaves. Senator Morrison followed behind him. He had written laws that made running away a hanging offense. Banker Coleman came next. He financed slave ships that brought fresh workers from Africa. These were not good men gathering for celebration. These were the architects of human suffering, the men who kept slavery alive in Virginia. Tonight would be their last meeting. In the kitchen house, Mama Josephine assigned final tasks. "Tobias, you handle the turtle soup tonight. Make sure it's perfect for our important guests." She trusted him completely with the most delicate dishes. She had no idea what that trust would cost. Tobias nodded and moved to his soup. Station. The large pot bubbled with rich broth made from beef bones and vegetables. It smelled wonderful. Soon it would smell like justice. The wedding ceremony began at 8 o'clock in the main parlor. Tobias could hear voices and laughter through the kitchen windows. Master Edmund stood beside his bride in her white satin dress. A traveling minister opened his prayer book. Candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Master Edmund replied. He had no idea he was promising to love and honor until death. Death that would come sooner than he expected. While the ceremony continued, Tobias made his final preparations. He reached into his shirt pocket and felt the small cloth bag. Inside was powder ground from castor beans and pokeweed berries, plants that grew wild around the plantation, seeds that looked harmless but carried ancient power. His mother's voice whispered in his memory, "When healing isn't enough, other medicine must be used." Tonight was that time. The ceremony ended with applause and congratulations. Guests began moving toward the dining room. House slaves lit extra candles and checked that every glass sparkled. The wedding feast was about to begin. "Start serving the soup," Mama Josephine called out. "They'll be hungry after all that standing and ceremony." This was the moment Tobias had planned for 8 months. He opened the cloth bag and held it over the soup pot. The powder looked like expensive ground spice. It had no smell, no color that seemed dangerous, perfect for what needed to happen. He thought about Rebecca's grave behind the slave quarters. about children sold away from crying mothers, about backs scarred by whips and spirits broken by cruelty. The powder fell into the soup like snow falling on Virginia soil. Tobias stirred the soup 3 times. The poison disappeared completely. No trace remained of what would soon become Virginia's deadliest meal. He ladled the soup into 30 fine china bowls, one for each guest who had gathered to celebrate power built on human misery. House slaves carried the bowls to the dining room on silver trays. Samuel walked carefully, balancing 4 bowls. Maria followed with more. Jenny brought the last ones. None of them knew they were serving justice along with soup. The dining room glowed with candlelight and crystal. Master Edmund sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his new bride beside him in her wedding dress. The most powerful people in Virginia surrounded them, all of them about to taste their final meal together. "To the union of our great families," called Judge Bellwood, Catherine's father. He raised his wine-glass high. "May this marriage bring prosperity to all our enterprises." The guests applauded and drank wine. They began eating their soup while discussing cotton prices and slave auctions. Steam rose from their bowls like incense at a funeral, their own funeral. "Excellent soup, Edmund," said Senator Harrison after his first spoonful. "Your cook has outdone herself tonight." "Mama Josephine learned her skills from her mother and grandmother," Master Edmund replied proudly. "These kitchen slaves have natural cooking instincts." He spoke about slaves like trained animals with useful tricks. He had no idea that one of those trained animals had just served him his death warrant. In the kitchen, Tobias cleaned his station and prepared other dishes. He worked calmly while listening to voices from the dining room, laughter and conversation, the sounds of people enjoying their final feast. Other slaves noticed his unusual calm. Samuel glanced at him with curious eyes. Maria hummed spirituals that spoke of deliverance. They sensed something building but didn't know what. The air felt different tonight, charged with possibility. The plant knowledge Tobias used worked slowly. The poison would begin gently. First, mild stomach discomfort, then growing nausea. Finally, violent sickness that no doctor could treat. The symptoms would start during the main course, when everyone had consumed full bowls of soup. 30 minutes passed. Tobias served the roasted turkeys and glazed ham. The guests praised everything that came from his hands. They had no idea they were complimenting their own executioner. "This ham has an unusual depth of flavor," commented Judge Morrison, the man who had sent dozens of runaway slaves to their deaths. "The seasoning is remarkable." Tobias had added extra spice to the ham glaze, too, not enough to be dangerous by itself, but enough to ensure that anyone who ate lightly of soup would still receive justice. 45 minutes after the soup service, Tobias began watching for the first signs. He pretended to work while keeping his eyes on the dining room windows. Senator Harrison paused mid-sentence and touched his stomach. A slight frown crossed his face, but he continued talking about tobacco prices. Judge Morrison reached for his wineglass with a hand that trembled slightly. Banker Coleman wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cool evening air. The poison was beginning its work. Catherine Bellwood Whitmore, the beautiful bride, suddenly looked pale. She pressed a hand to her throat and reached for her water glass. Her father noticed her distress and leaned closer with concern. "Are you feeling well, my dear?" "Just a slight upset stomach," she replied weakly. But her voice carried the first note of real fear. Master Edmund also showed symptoms. His face flushed red, and he loosened his collar. "Is it warm in here?" he asked, looking around the table with growing confusion. Other guests began experiencing similar problems. What had started as subtle discomfort was rapidly becoming obvious distress. They looked at each other with dawning awareness that something was seriously wrong. In the kitchen, Tobias put final touches on the wedding cake. Beautiful sugar roses decorated 3 perfect layers. Soon, chaos would erupt. In the dining room, the most powerful slave owners in Virginia were about to discover that their last supper had been exactly that. Justice was finally being served. The first scream came from the dining room just as Tobias finished cleaning his soup pot. Catherine Bellwood Whitmore doubled over in her chair. Her white wedding dress was stained with sweat and worse things. She clutched her stomach and cried out in pain that echoed through the house. "Something's wrong," shouted Judge Bellwood, trying to help his daughter. "She's been poisoned?" Panic erupted around the dining table, like fire catching dry wood. Senator Harrison vomited into his napkin while his face turned gray as ash. Banker Coleman collapsed onto the Persian rug. His body shook with violent spasms. Judge Morrison gripped the table edge so hard his knuckles went white. All 30 wedding guests showed signs of terrible sickness. The most powerful people in Virginia were dying like rats in their own mansion. Master Edmund struggled to stand, but fell back into his chair. His face was pale and covered in cold sweat. "Get the doctor," he gasped. "Send riders to town right now." But his voice was weak. His commands came out like desperate whispers. Even he knew no doctor could ride fast enough through the snow to help. House slaves ran in different directions. Some were truly shocked by what they saw. Others hid their satisfaction behind worried faces. Samuel dropped his serving tray and pretended to panic. Maria wrung her hands and wailed like she was heartbroken. But they all knew the truth deep down. No doctor alive could save these people now. In the kitchen, Mama Josephine heard the screaming and rushed toward the main house. "Lord have mercy! What's happening in there?" Her old eyes were wide with genuine fear. "Sounds like the guests are sick," Tobias replied calmly. He continued washing dishes like nothing unusual was happening. "Must be something they ate." His calm seemed natural. Kitchen slaves learned to keep working no matter what drama happened in the big house. But inside, Tobias felt the warm satisfaction of justice finally being served. The dining room had become a scene from hell. Wealthy plantation owners who had ruled Virginia for generations now crawled on expensive rugs. Their fine clothes were soiled with vomit and blood. Their dignified voices had become animal sounds of pain and terror. "It's the food," Senator Harrison managed to say, between waves of sickness. "We've all been poisoned by the food." Judge Morrison, who had sent so many runaway slaves to the gallows, now faced his own death. "Who would do this to us?" he wheezed. "Who has access to our kitchen?" Their eyes turned toward the kitchen house like arrows finding their target. Master Edmund tried to walk, but stumbled against the wall. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. His hands shook like autumn leaves. "The slaves," he whispered with growing understanding. "One of the kitchen slaves. Poisoned us all." The accusation hung in the air thick as smoke. Overseer Jake Preston burst through the front door. He had heard the screams from his cabin across the yard. A hard man who had whipped hundreds of slaves over the years. He looked around the dying room and understood the situation immediately. "I'll find who did this," he growled, pulling his pistol from his belt. "And they'll pay with their life." He stormed toward the kitchen house with 3 field hands behind him. Their faces showed mixed feelings, fear of punishment, but also secret respect for whoever had struck such a mighty blow against their oppressors. In the kitchen, Preston questioned Mama Josephine first. He pressed his gun barrel against her gray head. "What did you put in that soup, old woman?" "Nothing different," she cried truthfully. "Same recipe I've used for 20 years. Beef broth and vegetables and seasonings, nothing else." "Who else worked on the soup?" "Tobias helped with the seasonings. But he's been making that soup since he was a boy. He wouldn't hurt nobody." Preston's eyes found Tobias at his washing station. Everything about him looked innocent. shocked by the accusations, worried about the sick guests. Years of survival had taught him to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of humble submission. "You!" Preston shouted, pointing his gun at Tobias. "What did you put in that soup?" Tobias met his stare directly. "Salt and pepper and thyme and bay leaves. Same as always, Master Preston. I don't know what could have made them so sick." His voice carried the perfect tone of a confused slave who wanted to help. But Preston wasn't fooled. Something in Tobias's eyes burned too bright, too knowing. "Search him!" Preston ordered the field hands. They found nothing suspicious. The cloth bag that had held the plant powder was already burned to ash in the kitchen fire. Tobias had planned for this moment and left no evidence behind. Back in the dining room, the situation grew worse by the minute. Half the guests had lost consciousness. Others begged God for mercy they had never shown to slaves. The most powerful people in Virginia were learning what it felt like to be helpless. Preston returned to the kitchen with growing desperation. Time was running out to find someone to blame. He needed a confession, and he needed it now. "One of you poisoned those people," he announced, waving his pistol at all the kitchen slaves. "Confess now, and your punishment will be quick. Stay silent, and you'll all face the consequences." The threat was clear. If no one confessed, every kitchen slave would be punished severely, maybe executed as examples to others who might consider similar actions. Mama Josephine started crying. Samuel's hands trembled as he tried to look innocent. Maria mumbled prayers under her breath. Jenny stared at the floor to avoid eye contact with the overseer's angry stare. But Tobias remained calm in the center of the storm. This moment had been inevitable. From the beginning, he had always known someone would be blamed for tonight's justice. The only question was who would pay the price. "I did it." The words came out clear and strong. Every eye in the kitchen turned toward him as he stepped forward. "I put poison in the soup and ham," Tobias continued without fear. "I killed them all for what they did to my people." Preston's face twisted with rage and relief. He had his confession and his target for revenge. "Why?" Preston demanded, raising his pistol to Tobias's head. Tobias thought about Rebecca's grave, about children torn from their mother's arms, about backs scarred by whips and spirits broken by cruelty, about justice that would never come from Virginia courts. "Because somebody had to," he answered simply. Preston's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, desperate shouts erupted from the dining room. Master Edmund was calling for him with his dying breath. More than half the wedding guests had collapsed or died. The overseer was torn between immediate revenge and his duty to the masters. "Don't let him move!" Preston shouted to the field hands, then ran back to the main house. But the field hands looked at Tobias with new respect instead of hatred. This quiet kitchen slave had done what none of them dared imagine. He had struck down Virginia's most powerful plantation owners in a single night. They understood that some things were worth dying for. "Go," whispered Samuel, moving closer to Tobias. "We'll tell them you ran into the woods." "They'll hunt me down like a dog," Tobias replied calmly, "and they'll punish all of you for helping." "Some things are worth the risk," said Maria, tears streaming down her face. "What you did tonight will be remembered forever. Our children will hear this story for generations." Jenny grabbed a kitchen knife and cut the ropes the field hands had used to tie Tobias's hands. "The back door leads to the forest path. You know those woods better than any white man alive." Mama Josephine pressed a cloth bundle into his hands. "Bread and dried meat," she whispered. "May God protect you, child. You did what needed doing." Through the kitchen windows they could see chaos in the main house. House slaves ran between rooms carrying water and towels. But it was far too late. The poison had done its work thoroughly. Tobias moved toward the back door, then paused one final time. "Tell them I acted alone," he said quietly. "Tell them I was angry about Rebecca and wanted revenge. Don't let them think this was planned by others." He slipped into the snowy night as Preston's voice roared from the dining room. "Where is he? Where's that murderous slave?" By the time searchers reached the kitchen house, Tobias was deep in the Virginia forest. He knew every deer path and hiding place from childhood exploring. While dogs barked and men shouted behind him, he moved silently through trees that had sheltered runaway slaves for decades. Snow continued, falling, covering his tracks and muffling sounds. The same snow that had made the plantation look peaceful now helped a fugitive escape the justice that white men called law. Behind him, lanterns flickered between the trees like angry fireflies. Voices called out threats and promised reward money for his capture. But Tobias was already miles away, following old paths that led toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. By dawn, 18 of the 30 wedding guests were dead. The others would survive, but never fully recover. Virginia's most powerful plantation families had been devastated in a single Christmas Eve feast. Preston organized hunting parties that searched for weeks. Bloodhounds tracked scents through winter forests. Rewards were offered for information, but Tobias Hartwell had vanished like morning mist. Some said he reached the mountains and lived as a hermit. Others claimed he made it north to freedom. A few whispered that he had returned secretly to help other slaves escape. The truth became legend, and legends never die. Today, visitors to old Virginia plantations see restored mansions and pretty gardens. Tour guides tell clean stories about plantation life. They mention the tragic Christmas Eve incident of 1834 when wedding guests got sick from bad food. But they never tell the real story. Local historians know the truth, though. Court records still exist. Newspaper stories from Richmond to Charleston called Tobias Hartwell the most dangerous slave in Virginia history. But he was never caught. Old-timers in rural Virginia still share stories passed down through families. They speak of a ghost who appears near abandoned plantations. He carries the smell of herbs and the promise that justice delayed is not justice denied. Some say he's still out there, waiting, watching, ready to remind people that knowledge is power, and power can change everything. If this story amazed you, hit the like button. Share this with your friends and family. Got questions or know similar stories? Drop them in the comments. Subscribe for more incredible historical mysteries like this.